Nationalism, an ideology perhaps that's quite good for state building or rebuilding it when you think it's crumbling, but actually a very, very dangerous ideology. So nationalism gives us a really dangerous wind. It's dangerous because it's like a noise that dogs pick up, a dog whistle to a dog whistle, and populations, when they start hearing the noise of nationalism and start thinking of Nelson and Waterloo and start thinking of green and present lands and Jerusalem, their hearts and minds and souls become excited. However, it's very dangerous because, like a hard drug, it actually soon starts to destroy both individuals who adhere to it and to the societies that hold on to it. So it's extremely dangerous to selves, to nationalists, it's dangerous to countries and the citizens that live in them, but it's most dangerous to other societies because nationalism only works with a binary of us and them. And the more you focus and aggrandize and big up us, the more you focus on bringing down, castigating, scapegoating, and belittling others. And those others could be people inside your society who you don't like, from gypsies to subcultures and subnationalities, who you might very easily start labeling as traitors and saboteurs for not engaging in this new monolithic nationalist culture, but also external people, the French, the Germans, the EU, who might be considered as dangerous bullies. And in Donald Trump's vision of American nationalism, that includes the United Nations, the World Health Organization, all of whom are dangerous others. In this ideology, the only way that you can develop your sense of self, the identity of the collective nation, is to actually denigrate other people. You're always going to elevate the particular and the local and the parochial against the universal. So therefore, universal human rights have got to be replaced, and this sounds very familiar with May and Gove, by a British Bill of Rights. European law and laws of the sea have got to be replaced by British law and British rules of the sea. This is all part of restricting our vision of who we are and what we are from sharing the world as human beings in some collective universality, and reducing ourselves to simply being defined by our national identity. And I'll just end up with that introduction by saying that right now, and for the last 40 years, the country that we thought we lived in, the United Kingdom, or variously Great Britain, are being pulled asunder and ripped aside. And by the time we die, it's quite feasible that we'll be living in Little England. Scotland could go its own way, so could Wales, and so could Ireland. And if Sinn Féin get their way, then Northern Ireland will just be part of a united Ireland. So from the 15th century onwards in Europe, rulers were faced with the problem of collapsing Catholic Church, collapsing loyalties to feudalism and to local lords. And they had to start finding ways to attract citizens as subjects to pay taxes, fight in their armies. So they were trying to find new kinds of bonds, new kinds of legitimacies, new kinds of allegiances. Old sort of political realms, estates, bishoprics and kingdoms. Every country in Europe was a patchwork quilt of these little units with their own castles and their own lords and often their own laws. And of all the options, the one that seemed to catch on was the idea of trying to unite these patchwork quilts into a bigger unity. But other things had been tried. I mean, in Italy, city-states like Florence and Siena and Venice. In Switzerland, places like Geneva set up wonderful republics which thrived and blossomed. In Holland, you got the development of new kinds of civic republics which engaged in wars with the French and the Spanish to get their independence. However, imperial rulers, emperors, kings of France, kings of England, kings of Spain were not content to see disparate little political units going their own way and being autonomous. They wanted to bring them into a unity. So a third option was provided, which proved extremely successful. That is to bring into a big union, a big confederation, disparate units and political identities, and to try and impose some kind of legitimacy, some kind of account that would justify you giving up your allegiances to your local lord, to your particular church, to your own place and its conventions. The first country to try this was Holland, and the second country to do it was Britain. And we'll all know that Henry VIII was the man who did this in Britain. He left behind him dead Norfolks, dead Essexes. The Lancastrians destroyed the Yorkists. In the end, by the time Henry VIII had finished with England, it was now a united nation. And Queen Elizabeth fought for that against the French and the Spanish and everyone else who wanted to return to some kind of old order. But these states, like the ones Henry set up, were of course in a very precarious position. They were always being attacked by the papacy, Holy Roman emperors, foreign invaders, and of course old groups within them, like the Essexes and the Norfolks and the Yorkists, wanted to re-achieve their own personal autonomy. Without being able to appeal to something universalistic, like we all share a religion, they weren't left with much to do except destroy Catholicism. So Henry VIII and in Geneva, the new Protestants, in Holland, the new Protestants demanded the breakup of the allegiance to the papacy and to Catholicism, and the right to set up their own religions. Historians agree that the turning point in the debate comes not with Henry VIII or even with the Civil War, but with the end of the 19th century, so 18th century, when the French Revolution destroyed the old clerical order, it destroyed monarchy, it destroyed old notions of French unity and French diversity, the provinces. And the revolution wished to unite France into one new civic political order. When that collapsed in disorder, a general emerged from the army, Napoleon, who got hold of a particular rhetoric, the idea of France being a nation. And as he conquered his own country and then every other country, he took with it the idea of the French nation. What he did was to take a disunited territory, partly controlled by foreigners, and unite them into one place by claiming that everyone who lived in the territory of France was part of the people and was part of something called a nation. The word is natio. As his armies conquered local peoples, they began to adopt this rhetoric themselves. And so when he invaded Spain and left, the Spanish said, well, we must be a nation. When the Germans fought against the Prussians and the various German princedoms and republics fought against France and Napoleon, at the end of the war, people start to say, well, perhaps the Germans aren't a diverse package of different kingdoms and identities. Perhaps there's a German nation. Before long, Europe was burning. Europe was having revolutions all over the place, right the way through to Russia, as state after state claimed independence on the grounds that it was a nation. This is the basis of nationalism. The age of nation states is really 1820 to 1890. In this period, the shape, size, power, and roles of the states we know were cemented. The map of the world was redrawn by diplomats, often with a pen on a map. This is France, this is Czechoslovakia, this is Hungary. And later on, we do it in Africa. This is Nigeria, this is South Africa, this is Zimbabwe, and we do it in the Middle East. This is Iraq, this is Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. Each one of these places, which was previously a tribe or a kingdom, is all of a sudden a state. United because everybody in it shared a national identity. Britain and the UK are created out of separate kingdoms and estates and shaped as one nation, as is France and eventually Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Holland and Spain. It was a very slow process in two countries, Germany and Italy. Germany doesn't become a united nation until the third half of the 19th century, when the most powerful diplomat and ex-general Bismarck just about forced all the subgroups into one. And then in Italy, only in the 19th century with Mazzini and Garibaldi do you find that process happening. And it's never been happy. We've still got Basques and Catalans fighting the federal government in Spain. We've still got Walloons and Flems fighting the united government in Belgium, and I could go on. In our recent lifetimes, we've had Yugoslavia splitting up with Serbians, Bosnians, Croatians, all demanding they've got a nation and they've got a right to kill each other to get their national independence. And Britain was a united kingdom. It's now becoming a disunited group of nations, and all under the legitimate, apparently, story or narrative, a complete fiction that there is such a thing as nations. And just remember, as British Empire decolonized, as the Spanish Empire decolonized, as the German Empire decolonized, as the Belgian Empire did, what they left behind was nations. They drew on the map and said, you're a nation. People who had no idea of political unity. They were just told that they were given laws, they were given some kind of parliament, and people in some kind of disbelief were given independence, suddenly found themselves killing each other and falling apart because there was only a fiction of unity and identity. Remember, at the bottom of all this lies some idea of blood and soil. It's always about territory and blood. You're trying to mix identity and territory. And this is why walls and borders become absolutely, but identity is associated with space. Just look at your old stamp albums and look at how many nations have come and gone, places like Nyasaland. It's very interesting that most of the nationalist leaders in the 19th and 20th century had been to the country that had been their colonizers, gone to the universities, learnt about nations, and then gone back to their countries. So all these people like Nkrumah and Nati, Kenyatta, they were people, Nehru, Gandhi, they'd all learned this stuff from Europe and then gone back to their countries and said, now we should be a nation. We will ape these other countries. So the nationalist proposition is that all, and this is, just listen to this, it's absolutely preposterous. Nationalism is a complete fiction. All previous and existing forms of allegiances are illegitimate or totally inferior. You can hold on to them, but basically you are now a member of a new unity, and it's the only one that's legitimate. It trumps all others, and it's called the nation. Nations are ontologically superior. They're more real than individuals, countries, estates, even states. A state is not legitimate unless it's a nation. Unless the borders of a state fit the realm of a nation, it's not legitimate. And every nation has a right to a state of its own. Primordial national identity or nationalism is claimed. You go back to King Arthur or King Alfred or William Wallace, and you find in the past some hero, and you say, the British nation started there, when it never did, but that's a useful device. Only liberation of the nation from foreign control will allow you to be free and give you sovereignty and allow you to have justice. All of us are either free nations or you're oppressed by some foreigners. Only when national identity or a people is mapped onto the territory of a state is that state legitimate. All other affiliations are regarded as illegitimate. The nation states are the only sovereign legitimate political bodies. So even federal states, unions, federated groups, multinationals are illegitimate. So the USSR is illegitimate. America's with the United States, that's illegitimate. The United Kingdom's illegitimate. The European Union's illegitimate. To nationalists, no union bigger than the nation has legitimacy, and anyone who thinks it does is a traitor and some kind of saboteur. Well, the impacts of this ideology, which I'm arguing only comes about after 1789 in Europe and doesn't have any existence beforehand, people felt allegiances to kings or religions or other sorts of things, has had a massive impact. Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Czechs, Croats, Serbians broke away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire when it collapsed, and then Russia. Wales, Scotland, Ireland breaking away from GB. Basques and Catalonians against Spain. Flems and Walloons in Belgium. And just think about the Middle East. The Middle East is now cracking up as one group after another claims independence from some apparently superior colonizer. Nationalist parties, uprisings on one side, and regimes using nationalism to repress other national groups are a continuous source of violence. And here's my punchline. Nationalism has fueled the worst wars, the worst killings, the worst pogroms that we've seen in the world. In the notion of national freedom, we've conducted World War I and World War II. And it's still going on today. The EU, the United Nations, all those organizations created in 1945 to stop nations ripping each other to pieces are now being undermined by Farage, Cummings, Johnson, Trump, and all those other nationalists in Europe, which I'll refer to later. Well, what is this? Well, it's in part a re-emergence of tribalism all over the world as globalization has started to fail, as economic progress has started to fail, as we've had economic collapses, as the environment is having its impact and people are migrating from areas where they can't live anymore. As the world's become very unstable, people have returned to sort of more fundamental basic structures which they hope will save them. And one of them is tribes. Just look around the world how tribes are reasserting themselves. It's also partly sectarianism. Again, people who feel now destabilized, confused about who they are and where they belong because structures are breaking down, look to sectarian alliances. They're looking to be Hindus again, Sikhs, Buddhists, Sunnis, Shias, Catholics. There's a retreat to old sectarian allegiances and cleavages, which we thought we'd left behind. We thought that as states grew, as globalization took place, we would get more cosmopolitan, universalistic agendas, but people are retreating to particulars, tribalism, sectarianism, and fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is just going back to the basics. This is like Hezbollah, Zionism. I mean, what's Netanyahu doing? He's going back to some kind of absolute right-wing fundamentalist Zionist set of ideas about who the Jewish people are, which is not shared by Jewish socialists, not shared by Jewish liberals, not shared by Jewish cosmopolitans. Now, here's the shocking thing. The word nation doesn't appear in any vocabulary until the 15th century. And then it only appears as a name for a residence, like a hall of residence at Bologna University. So one of the first universities in Europe was Bologna. People traveled from all over Europe to study there. And the people from sort of French area would go to one set of hotels and the English to another. Germans. And so somebody in the university coined the word natio to refer to the identity, the spatial identity, the geographical area from which the students in that college of accommodation came. Listen, there is no such thing as a nation. Nations are complete fictions. The only thing that's real is human beings in relationships with one another. But then you can frame it, narrate it, construct an ideological framework that says you're all Aryans, and you can have racist ideologies, or you can impose sexist ideologies, or you can impose nationalist ideologies. Later on, you do find in some French books in the 17th century some references to place of birth. The natio is used to refer to Picardy, the nation of Picardy, the nation of Normandy, the nation of Provence in certain legal documents. In Britain, the first definition of natio is in Samuel Johnson's dictionary in the middle of the 18th century, when he uses it to refer to professions. So he talks about the natio of physicians, the natio of journalists, the natio of lawyers. Yes, it's nothing to do with a people. There's no talk about the English nation or the Scottish nation. In Scotland, it was first used in the early 19th century to refer to something bigger than a clan and smaller than a state. So people talked about the nation of Buchans, Murrays and Anguses. The French nationalist Joseph de Maistre in the late 18th, early 19th century identified the nation as the king and its nobility, but other people use it in very different ways. Now, where it gets real purchase is in the Romantic Enlightenment. You know, opposed to all these rationalists and progress thinkers and liberals in Europe, you got the Romantics, you know, Beethoven and Goethe and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all that sort of stuff, and all the Romantic poets and all the Romantic artists like, you know, Turner and so on. Okay, so in opposition to people like Adam Smith and all these rational economists, people started turning to some idea that we were more than self-calculating individuals who wanted to be by ourselves, making money, getting progress, getting knowledge and power. They started to look back to the Gothic past, the Gothic version as against the classical version of history. They discovered German tribes, Saxons and Angles. They started to discover old tracts, old poems, sagas from Beowulf, etc., etc. And they began to discover old unities that existed prior to modernity. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, was the first person to actually argue that there's something more important than rational calculation. There's the deep emotional feeling you get of belonging, which you can only get from sharing things with common stock, your people. And in the end, Rousseau argues in his book, The Social Contract, that the real social contract derives from the people, not from individuals agreeing, as in a written contract, a legal contract, but from a general will, which is the expression of the deep, irrational and rational feelings of what it is to belong. He's the first person to talk about the people. So there's an image of Rousseau on the left. Now, he is the emblem of the French Revolution. He's the emblem of Napoleon. So when Napoleon wants to unite the French people against everybody else, he starts talking about the people. The people then is turned into a historical reality by an act of complete historical construction, a complete fictionalizing. So every country then starts ransacking its history for people, for tribes and groups who will give some meaning to this new narrative. Well, it doesn't take long for Napoleon to start setting up people's courts. We suddenly have the people's assemblies. We suddenly have national assemblies, national parks, national art galleries, national archives, national armies. All of a sudden, elites in Europe start rebranding everything from libraries and universities through to armies, law institutions. Everything becomes national. This fiction, which was once just a name given to a college for people from a certain area, has now turned into reality. Flesh has become the body. Sorry, the spirit has become flesh. Now we have national currencies, national dress, national space centers, national teams. Everything's now belongs to a nation. And just how divisive is that? Just look at it with football. The football fans hating each other because they come from a different nation. The way people go on holiday and the Brits behave one way and the Germans behave another. The only way to grow yourself as a nation is to big yourself up, big up your power of us. And the only way to do that is to denigrate and destroy others, and that is other nations. All categories work with binaries: man, woman, up, down, right, wrong, left, right, etc. I could go on forever, but them and us is the crucial one. Once you start saying that who you are and what you are is a collective us, and that you find out who you are by setting yourself against them, whether it's them in your society who are not like us, or them out there in other societies or groups, you're in serious trouble. Instead of sharing the human race, sharing brotherhood, sharing rights and sharing laws, sharing respect and dignity and care as equal human beings, you've now segregated the world into them and us. And there's lots of thems and only one us. And you are superior. Make Britain great again. Make Germany great again. Make Scotland great again. Make France great again. And as you do that, you denigrate, you create conflicts, you disunite and fragment what took from 1945 until 2000 to create the idea of a more cosmopolitan world with unions, federations, agreements and cooperation rather than competition, conflict and hatred. So essentially, you create us by denigrating others. You scapegoat them. You scapegoat gypsies, you scapegoat East Europeans, you scapegoat people from the wrong part of Britain, people who don't act like you. They're traitors, they're saboteurs, they're second-rate citizens, and you scapegoat everybody else. It's always someone else's fault if something goes wrong with the economy, something goes wrong with COVID-19. Brexit and Dominic Cummings is fueled by nationalist fervour. What he's done is to weaponize Brexit with the arsenal of nationalism. And that's what Sturgeon is doing in Scotland. These are dangerous people using a very dangerous ideology. And I can imagine if Boris Johnson doesn't allow the Scots more and more independence, a referendum and freedom, I can imagine Scots people starting to bomb, starting to use violence, because they'll have been fueled with this idea that their only true identity is as a Scottish nation. What you do is you identify the threat to your nation from foreigners. So for the Scots, it's us. It's the English who are the foreigners. To the English, it's the EU who are the foreigners. You construct a narrative of waves of invaders. You're always talking about the threat of invaders. Do you remember when there were all these Turks going to be invading us? 66 million Turks were going to be invading us. They were coming in great swarms. So we've got to build walls and stop them. You frame your nation as a single nation when it's not. I mean, Britain's very divided, it's very fragmented. It's, you know, there's a difference between Yorkshire people and Lancastrians, between people from the southwest and Londoners. It's not just the Scots and the Welsh versus the English. It's far more complicated. But you say we in our group, us, are one group, and then there's the others, the Muslims, the foreigners. Then you identify these enemies as people from nowhere. Remember, Theresa May said, you're either people from somewhere in this nation or you're people from nowhere. And then you call anyone who supports that view, anyone who supports the European Union, for instance, you call them Remoaners, Remainers, traitors and saboteurs. Even judges applying the rule of law are traitors and saboteurs. Then you keep illustrating the narrative of sovereignty of the people, which means the nation will regain, it will take back control of its borders and take back control of all the powers and rights, because it's a nation and it's not, it's just a fiction. Taking back control for the people is the weapon of choice. No failure is allowed. All objections is fake news from traitors and saboteurs. Well, what I want to do is just spend a few minutes deconstructing the people and deconstructing the nation. As far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as the people. There are only people. I mean, you're people. You think, you have needs, you have feelings, you can be upset, you can be insulted. Can you really say that a people feel, has needs? Does this thing called the people have a mind? Does it think? Can it be insulted? Well, I know in law you can create a corporate personality, so you can set up a business, Apple or Marks and Spencers, and it can have a kind of corporate personality, so you can sue it and get money from it, and it has a single identity. But actually, that's only a corporate identity. You can talk about a state as being a single unity, but that as a legal unity, yes. But does it think? Does it have free will? Does it have feelings? Does it have needs? Does it have a psyche? Does it have a soul? Does a state, a nation, this thing called has it got the attributes that it's being applied to it? I don't think so. It's basically the pathetic fallacy where you take something that belongs to one thing and apply it to another when it has absolutely no value. Really, the people is just dreamed up by elites, imposed upon people to make them feel good. Oh, you can feel really as if you belong now. You can really feel French, or you can really feel English. But actually, it is just a misuse of language, a misuse of history, a misuse of people by elites who are like puppeteers. Nationalist leaders are puppeteers, blowing dog whistles, calling back to ancient belongings and groupings and allegiances to justify their present activities. Now, the whole thing is essentially contested. I originally had 4 slides. I talked about essential contestability, but essential contestability is when terms are used where actually there isn't a neutral, objective, independent meaning for it. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One could be that the term has lots of different usages. I gave you the example before of a man. It could be a chess piece, it could be your husband, it could be your servant, it could just be not a female. But it's mainly essential contestability arises when people start embedding values within terms. So they start embedding in male, not just certain chromosomes, but superior, strong, rational. And then they start embedding in female, not just a different set of chromosomes, but inferior, deferential, sex objects, etc., etc. Now, many words are now lacking objective clarity. They are essentially contestable. And the word people and the word nation are 2 of them. Essentially, when people use the word people, they are using it in a very bloated, affected, ideological, persuasive way. So just give you an example. These conservatives, since Mrs. Thatcher, have denied that there is such a thing as a collectivity. There's no such thing as society. There's no such thing as a class. There's no such thing. There's no groupings had any validity. The only thing that was real was isolated private individuals. And then all of a sudden, because it's in their interests as Brexiteers to talk about it, Dominic Cummings and Gove and Johnson start talking about the people, the people's will. Well, I don't believe there is such a thing as the people. I think it's a fiction. That this people has a will, and that will is to be independent of the EU and to kick foreigners out or repatriate them, is just Dominic Cummings and a certain group of people writing and narrating and framing reality in a way that absolutely suits them. Now, I want to then, I've just got examples there of different uses of the word people. There is not one use. When Cummings or Nicola Sturgeon or Edouin in Turkey or Oban in Hungary starts banging on about their people, they are just creating a fiction. They're creating a kind of puppet, a scarecrow, to frighten other people. But the one thing's in common is either you're in the people or you're against the people. You're either one of us or you're one of them. It's an effective way for new elites to unite a certain group by hating and dividing against others, therefore gaining control by increasing paranoia, fear, so people are more manipulable. This is what's going on in Turkey, it's what's going on in Hungary, it's what's going on all over the world. It's going on in Britain right now, and it's going on in America. And I've gone through all sorts of dictionaries, but I also want to say it's the same for the word nation. The word nation has no consistent use. It's essentially contestable. And so what nationalists do is they pick up on certain ideas of the nation. Now, it's quite, what's the fault? What's the problem of people having national football teams or national cricket teams, you might say? It's all great fun. But it's more than that, isn't it? Because when you have these games, people start singing their songs and then they bring up old hatreds. And often people get drunk and they start fights, and it creates a whole lot of unpacks, a whole lot of antagonisms. So I've given a whole lot of definitions. Is a people someone who shares the common language? That's how the Germans use. The German nationalists say, if someone speaks German, they're German, which is why Hitler justified invading all those countries, Poland and, didn't he, Czechoslovakia, because there were some German people that like 1,000 German people in one place, so we'll conquer the whole country and then they'll become the master race because all these other races are in fear. The German people have to be united in one nation. Other people, a nation is just sharing some views, or it's a cultural thing. It's about art and music. There's no such thing as a nation. Nations are fictions, and you can shape them as you like. The greatest politicians are the greatest narrators. And that's why Johnson's doing so well, because in the end, he's a narrator. He just tells stories. They mean nothing. They don't refer to reality, but people like stories, and he's a great storyteller. So nationality is a whole set of conflations and mistakes. It's about forging an imaginary group to get over real problems in society, real divisions. You get over it by forging an imaginary group. You conflate legal personality with real people. You then start denigrating groups and like tribes, clans, families, types of people within your society, and trying to force them to unite, like not wear burqas. You're not allowed to say this. You've got to learn this language. You've got to have a kind of citizenship test. And then you start imagining that these people shared a past and that they will share a future. If you read Eric Hobsbawm's book on, I've forgotten what it's called. Anyway, Eric Hobsbawm's got a book called The Invention of Tradition. He says that nationalism is a complete fiction, but it's a very powerful fiction. It was completely invented. The whole idea of Scottish clans and Scottish kilts and whiskey drinking is just a modern. Well, there have been critics of all this. Jacob Talman says it just legitimizes totalitarian control over people. It's a totalitarian ideology. Karl Popper argues that it closes off society. Instead of having open, democratic, liberal pluralism, people can say what they like, they're shut up. People are forced into cultural and other kinds of conformity. Bertrand Russell says it's just a device for misleading people. George Orwell thought it was evil. I'll quote him in a minute. Isaiah Berlin says that it stops people being free by imposing the freedom of the nation. Means that you have to lose your freedom and possibly your life. Of course, actually sacrificing your life for the nation in a war is the greatest thing you can do. Well, it's probably about the worst thing you can do. So for nationalists, the important thing is to raise awareness. If this is a fiction, you've got to convince people it exists. So what you do is you talk about Boudicca, Alfred, Arthur the Great, William Wallace, Lord Nelson, the Second World War, Winston Churchill. You start making people aware Mark Francois, a little twat from the south of England, he bigs up his father on a minesweeper and says, you know, we're now, as we were in the Second World War, dealing with foreigners. You conjure up these astonishing fictions and present them as reality. You then fashion reality out of this fiction. You start writing your curriculum. Just look at Gove's curriculum for British education, for British history. But then the Scottish write their own curriculum, the French have their own. And in the end, these histories are mutually incompatible. You have to have your own signifiers, passports, your own flags, your own money. This is absolutely crucial. What do the Brexiteers want? Our own passport, our own money. That's the absolutely crucial thing, and our borders. And national holidays are really important. Constant celebrations of Independence Days, heroes, songs, anthems, to reenact the identity. Note recently, our May Day holiday, invented by the last Labour government for workers, has now been rebadged as VE Day, a national day of celebration for winning a war. And all along, the remnants of older shared loyalties are whitewashed and eroded away to be replaced by national ones. So this is an invention. It's basically saying that all people within the state share a nationality, which they don't. I mean, there are Sikhs and Muslims and Scots. There are people from all over the world in Britain, but apparently we all share a nationality and a national identity, which we don't. We're basically saying that all people in Britain are of one nation and they share the same mind, the shared needs, the same ideas, the same future, which we do not. The fictional nation is now clothed with the attributes of a real thing, a real person, one who can be insulted and injured by the EU and Remainers. A new nation is a person, and it's got to triumph. Well, I won't go on too much about that, but the nation now is one where, and this is the astonishing thing, the only legitimate state is one that encloses a nation. You can't have more than one nation in a state that's not legitimate. Of course it's legitimate. That's Britain. That's America. That's the USSR. But nationalists just say it's illegitimate. It's unjustifiable. And they produce these arguments. Now, this idea, I could live with the fiction that there are nations and that we can feel national affiliation. But where does this idea come from? That every nation has got to be self-determining. Why can't a nation just share with other nations fishing or air or something? Oh, sorry. Sorry about this. Well, I'll just have to go a bit slower. You can see from this slide that this idea has really caught on. And it's had very bad problems. It creates a kind of slippery slope. You start off by talking about the nation, but before long you're talking about getting rid of foreigners. Remember Theresa May's lorry going round saying, snoop on a foreigner and we'll help them get back home. Building walls, getting rid of people, your national identity, passports. But that is a slippery slope, because what happens if the foreigners don't go home? Well, you ghettoize them. And if they and you humiliate them, you try and get them to go home by intimidating them. You can then resort to expulsion. You just throw them out of the country. And if that won't go, you exterminate them. Pogroms, the final solution, was the result of a claim that there is only one great nation, the German nation, that all others are sub-nations, and you've got the right to exterminate them, to make yourself an autonomous, free, self-determined nation. Nationalism is a slippery slope. It starts off with cheering your rugby team and appreciating your own language, your own culture, your own food and ways of living. It ends up in concentration camps, slaughtering millions of people. And now I want to illustrate that. You might think, well, we don't have any nationalists in Britain. Well, one of them is a really powerful man, powerful in the Conservative Party. I know this guy, I've sat next to him, I've argued with him a great deal over decades. He died recently, but he's had a massive impact on British politics, and his name's Roger Scruton. Now, Roger Scruton was a Thatcherite individualist. He believed there were only individuals, and he actually wrote, I've got quotes from him, where he says, nationalism is a very dangerous idea, and it collapses, as I've said, into hatred of other people, and it's not a good idea. But he ended up supporting Brexit. He ended up supporting the idea of the nation, a British nation, and he ended up supporting nationalism. He talked about the superiority of the sentiment and ideology of attachment that is nationalism. The state's role and purpose, he writes, is to uphold the national identity through political action. It has a consciousness, a nation, that renders intelligible and justifies the habits of association amongst neighbours. It's a consciousness of national identity, therefore, is stronger than any revocable agreement to be governed. It's stronger than the British Constitution and the rule of law. National identity and allegiance is even more important than the law. And that's just one picture of Roger Scruton. He thought fox hunting was the real mark of an Englishman. So he had his horses and he would go on the hunt and chase on. He'd come back and saying, you know, I feel invigorated. I feel now part of this great nation. So this is what he says. This is it. The division besetting the continent today is not between totalitarian socialism and free democracy. The battle line is between adherence to the nation and its language, institutions, and religious inheritance on one hand, and on the other, cosmopolitan visions of a non-national order, a borderless economy with universal human rights. Then battle line isn't between socialism and communism, public and private individuals. It's now between the nation and cosmopolitanism, the people who support the news from nowhere. The conflict, he goes on, this is quotations, the conflict between left intelligentsia and human nature has shifted from the fear of socialism versus capitalism to the new sphere of enlightened liberalism versus national loyalties, which tries to sweep all of those versus a residual nationalism and the inherited sentiments of identity and belonging. It seems to me, he says, that the conflict between the, yes, okay, so I've just sort of said that, quoted it again. So we must recognize, he says, that without national identity and loyalty and what stems from it, there is no way to build citizens. Democracy and the rule of law are realities. Opposing sides can live with each other on terms. Can they live with each other on these terms? The answer is simply, they don't break down. I can't quite see what my slide is. Anyway, he says that the loyalty of citizens is not towards the government, it's towards something higher. So ultimately, your loyalty is not to the rule of law, to the constitution, to our parliament, our way of living. It's something higher, something that is shared between all citizens, regardless of their political beliefs and inclinations. This higher thing is the nation, the entity to which we all belong and which defines the first person plural of democratic politics. Without this shared we, it is impossible for democracies to endure. And it is precisely by destroying this we that the communists are able to retain their grip on power, ruling as a pure they of dictatorship. So you lot, Labour Party supporters, anyone who believes in Europe, anyone who believes in any kind of collectivity other than the nation is in the grip of this terrible thing. Well, surprisingly, Christians didn't like this. I'll pick up speed because they thought the superior thing was God. Liberals didn't like it because they thought the superior thing was the individual, and you should submerge individuals into these great collective unities. So I found all these people attacking. Hayek would have absolutely died because, you know, the road to serfdom is when you start believing in collectivities. So I've discovered lots of quotations where he actually, screwed in earlier life, sort of rejects completely Rousseau. And this final quote at the bottom, where this is what he wrote in 1979 in his Dictionary of Political Thought. He says, the concept of the people's will represents difficulties similar to those presented by the idea of race and the Volksstaat. That's the Nazi idea. So he's traveled from an Thatcherite individualism to nationalism in the same way that Boris Johnson, Gove and Cummings have taken a Conservative Party from liberal individualism to collective nationalism. And now the people's will trumps everything. I just want to cut right the way through to lots of it. I just want to give you a bit of where this leads. I'm just going to quote you a bit of Hitler. I do not want to promise them that this resurrection of the Volk will come by itself. We are willing to work. It should never make the mistakes of believing that liberty and happiness will fall from heaven. It's all got to be our own work. We shall never believe in foreign help, never believe in help from outside our nation, outside our Volk. The German people is itself alone. Only when we have leading German people towards the means of its own industriousness, its own defiance, its own perseverance, only then will we rise up. Just as our fathers once made Germany great, not with the help of others, but on our own. And this brings us to our sixth item, clearly the goal of our struggle. The whole purpose of life is the preservation of the people and the soil. The preservation of this Volk for the future is a realization this alone can constitute our reason for being. My God, can you see the connection between German nationalism, which leads to fascism and Nazism, Italian nationalism that leads to fascism and Mussolini, our English nationalism that leads here, but could lead on to something much more dangerous in the future. Gordon Brown pointed this out and was humiliated for doing it when he saw that a woman who was expressing racist views, he said quietly, she's a bigot, and so she was. But we're not allowed to call out bigotry now. We're not allowed to call out nationalism, racism, hatred, and sexism. We've all got to keep quiet, go out and clap every night, celebrate belonging to this great nation with its own national health service. So I'll come towards the end. I'm quite in favour of patriotism. What's wrong with liking your country? What's wrong with liking your neighbours, liking your food, liking your football teams, liking your culture and your dress? I've got nothing wrong with diversity and difference and a sense of belonging. I've certainly got it. That's not dangerous. What's dangerous is weaponising that, politicising it, taking that perfectly legitimate and understandable set of feelings and allegiances and turning it into a unified political ideology which excludes, dominates, dictates, and in the end, it's got an ideological form. There's no such things as individuals. Human nature is simply what's shaped by the nation. it has a kind of mystical spirit you can't identify. There's always mysticism in nationalism. The whole of history is subverted. So you don't have real history, you just have history of your nation. The whole of the future is not shaped by nations working together to solve problems. It's all about national trajectory, national triumph. I'll go on to the very end then. All that glitters is not gold. What I'm trying to say is that many of the people who've written about nationalism, and I've got stacks of books on my shelf, they all show that what starts off as a nice bit of rhetoric by Nasser or by Sturgeon or by Cummings ends up leading a people to ruin. Trump is leading America to ruin. Johnson is leading Britain to Brexit and ruin. And by the way, I had a nice phrase in The Guardian today. We've got to get exit done to get Brexit done. We've got to get exit done to get Brexit done. And if that means people dying to get exit done, it doesn't matter, because we've got to get Brexit done. And why have we got to get Brexit done? What's the legitimation? One Britain, one England, I should say, the nation, the people, unified, overthrowing liberal elites, overthrowing foreigners to get back sovereignty and autonomy. The radical right love it, but there's a lot of evil awaiting. Nationalism unpacks a whole lot of problems. So the last slide is, nationalism is a fiction, but it's a fiction that plays well with audiences. And nationalists are people who know how to make people feel good about belonging to us. But the other side of the coin is they feel good because they can now see them next door, them in the next street, them across the channel who you can hate. It's ineffective. It's effective only in covering up and distracting people from the real problems about the environment, about inequality and injustices. We got real problems to deal with, but this nationalist fiction sort of covers it all up and says the only issue is us and the EU. And it's just, it works to cover up and distract people from real failings, particularly the failings you've created. The Conservatives have been using individualism, neoliberalism. They produced austerity. They brought us to this terrible calamity that the last minute they produced Johnson to suddenly say that wasn't our fault, that was liberal elites. We're now populist nationalists and we'll make it all right for you as long as you kick out the EU. In the end, always nationalism leads to more division and hatred and violence. It scapegoats people. It erodes trust in law. It erodes trust in the state. It erodes trust in citizenship. But nationalists are like idiots in a gasworks with a box of matches. They have invented a fiction and they won't be content until reality is destroyed or fits into their fiction. So socialists beware. Don't be lulled into nationalism. It's a threat to us as a party. It's a threat to our vision of how we should live. Nationalists are dangerous people. And I think the Labour Party should set about Plaid Cymru. We should set about Sinn Féin. We should set about Nicola Sturgeon. These nationalists are dangerous people. And if we want to win back voters in those countries, we need to tell people that Britain, the United Kingdom, are collective unions, we're federated nations, we have a collective past and a collective future. We're better together than apart. And that's basically the lecture. And I'd like to know what you think. So I'll put